Chapter 1. The Unseen Touch. Ilara moved through the opulent rooms of the Sterling Corporation's penthouse suite with a practiced, almost invisible grace. Her uniform, a crisp navy blue, was her armor, blending her into the shadows of polished mahogany and gleaming chrome. Her days were a silent ballet of dusting, polishing, and ensuring every surface, every cushion, reflected the pristine image of its owner, Mr. Julian Sterling. Julian Sterling was a name whispered in hushed reverence in boardrooms and financial circles. He was the titan, the visionary, the man who had built Sterling Corp from the ground up. To Ilara, he was simply the occupant of the penthouse, a presence she acknowledged with a polite nod when their paths rarely crossed. Her world was one of hushed footsteps and the faint scent of lemon polish. She knew the Sterling penthouse intimately, not as a home, but as a meticulously maintained space. She knew the exact angle of the abstract art that adorned the walls, the specific pressure needed to buff out a smudge on the vast glass windows overlooking the glittering city, and the subtle shift in Julian Sterling's demeanor when he returned from a particularly grueling day. Today was one of those days. The air in the penthouse crackled with an almost palpable tension as he entered, his tailored suit a dark storm cloud against the bright afternoon. He didn't acknowledge her. His eyes, a startling shade of ice blue, were fixed on some internal landscape of deals and deadlines. Ilara, as always, retreated, her task to ensure his sanctuary remained undisturbed. She was dusting his study, a room dominated by a massive oak desk littered with documents and a single unopened bouquet of lilies. The scent was overpoweringly sweet, a stark contrast to the usual crisp, sterile aroma of the office. Ilara paused, her duster hovering. Julian Sterling, a man who commanded boardrooms with effortless authority, seemed lost. A deep sigh escaped his lips, a sound so heavy it seemed to pull the air from the room. He ran a hand through his already tousled dark hair, his gaze distant. Ilara's heart, a well-trained observer of subtle cues, felt a pang of something akin to sympathy. She knew her place. She was the unseen hand, the silent guardian of his immaculate world. But today the sheer weight of his weariness was a physical presence. He sank into his chair, staring at the lilies as if they held the answer to an unsolvable equation. He remained like that for a long time, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the city. Ilara continued her work in the adjacent rooms, her movements deliberately slow, her presence a quiet reassurance, a testament to the order that still existed in his chaotic life. Later, as she prepared to leave, she noticed the lilies still untouched. A flicker of an idea, bold and entirely out of character, sparked within her. She tiptoed back into the study, her heart thrumming a nervous rhythm. She carefully selected a single lily, its petals a creamy white, and placed it on a small, elegant notepad on his desk, right beside his hand. It was a small gesture, a silent offering, a tiny ripple in the smooth surface of his controlled existence. She left the penthouse, the click of the door a soft punctuation mark to her day, wondering if the unseen touch of a maid would ever be acknowledged by the formidable Julian Sterling. Chapter 2. A Whisper in the Silence. The next morning Ilara arrived at the penthouse with a familiar knot of apprehension in her stomach. Her encounter with the lilies the previous day had been an act of almost unconscious empathy, a departure from her usual stoic professionalism. She braced herself for, she wasn't sure what. A subtle shift in the atmosphere? A fleeting glance of curiosity from Julian Sterling? But the penthouse was as she'd left it, impeccably maintained, silent. As she began her morning rounds, her gaze was drawn to Julian Sterling's study. The single lily she had placed on his desk was gone. A small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief escaped her. It hadn't been a mistake then. Perhaps he had noticed. Perhaps it had meant something, however insignificant. She continued her duties, her thoughts a quiet hum beneath the surface of her routine. Later that day, as she was clearing away a discarded coffee cup from the living area, Julian Sterling emerged from his study. He was on the phone, his voice a low, resonant baritone, discussing figures that meant nothing to Ilara. He walked towards the balcony, his back to her, his gaze fixed on the sprawling cityscape. He ended his call with a curt, understood, and turned. For the first time, his icy blue eyes met hers directly. Alara froze, her hand holding the coffee cup mid-air. He looked at her, not with his usual detached indifference, but with a flicker of something unreadable. He paused, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to the empty spot on the notepad where the lily had been. Then he looked back at her, a faint, almost imperceptible quirk at the corner of his lips. "The lilies," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, devoid of its usual edge. "They were a nice touch." Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her directly, beyond a brief instruction or a perfunctory acknowledgement. Her heart gave a strange little leap. "Thank you, sir," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He held her gaze for another moment, then nodded, a subtle gesture that conveyed more than a longer speech might have. He then turned and walked back into his study, leaving Alara standing there, a blush creeping up her neck. The exchange was minuscule, a mere speck of interaction in the vast expanse of their separate worlds. But for Alara, it felt like a chasm had been bridged. The unseen touch had been felt, acknowledged. The following days unfolded with a subtle shift. Alara still moved through the penthouse with her characteristic quietness, but there was a new awareness in the air. Julian Sterling didn't engage her in conversation, but his eyes would sometimes linger on her for a moment longer, a fleeting curiosity in their depths. Once he even offered a small, almost shy smile as she handed him his morning newspaper. Alara found herself looking forward to these small moments, these tiny cracks in his formidable facade. She began to notice more about him. The way he would absent-mindedly tap his pen when deep in thought. The way his shoulders would slump just a fraction when he was exhausted. The occasional faint shadow of stubble on his jaw that she sometimes had to meticulously remove from his shirt collar. She was still the maid, the invisible caretaker, but her perception of him was changing, softening, blooming into something she couldn't quite define, a delicate flower pushing through the polished marble of her daily life. The Sterling penthouse, once just a workplace, was slowly becoming a space where two disparate lives had brushed against each other, leaving an unexpected imprint. Chapter 3. The Shared Sunset. The subtle shifts in their interactions continued, like the slow unfurling of a delicate fern. Julian Sterling, once a ghost of a presence, began to inhabit the penthouse with a more visible, though still reserved, humanity. He still commanded the respect and distance befitting his position. But Alara found herself privy to increasingly intimate glimpses of his world. She learned to anticipate his needs not just through her training, but through a growing understanding of his habits. She'd have his preferred brand of tea ready before he even asked, have his reading glasses placed on his favorite armchair, and ensure the ambient lighting in his study was precisely calibrated for late-night work. One evening, as Alara was finishing her duties, she heard the distinct sound of a sigh from the balcony. It wasn't the sigh of weariness she had grown accustomed to, but something softer, more contemplative. Peeking through the gap in the study door, she saw Julian Sterling standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the room, silhouetted against the breathtaking panorama of the city at dusk. The sky was a canvas of fiery oranges, soft purples, and fading blues, a spectacle that even the most hardened executive couldn't entirely ignore. Hesitantly, Alara approached the open doorway. She saw him holding a glass of amber liquid, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He seemed lost in thought, his usual formidable posture softened by the quiet beauty of the dying day. Usually, she would have retreated immediately, her presence an intrusion, but something held her. Perhaps it was the shared appreciation for the sunset, a silent communion that transcended their disparate roles. Julian Sterling turned, a flicker of surprise in his eyes as he noticed her. He didn't immediately dismiss her. Instead, he gestured with his glass towards the window. "Remarkable, isn't it?" he said, his voice low, almost reverent. Alara, caught off guard, could only nod. "It is, sir." He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze returning to the vibrant sky. "It's easy to forget in the midst of all this." He gestured vaguely with his free hand, encompassing the city, the penthouse, the implied world of Sterling Corp, that there's still this. Alara found herself stepping further into the room, drawn by the unexpected intimacy of the moment. It's a reminder of perspective, perhaps, she offered softly, surprising herself with her own boldness. Julian Sterling turned to her again, a thoughtful expression on his face. This time there was no trace of impatience or indifference. He seemed genuinely intrigued. Perspective, he echoed. Yes, that's a good word for it. He paused, then extended the glass he was holding towards her. Would you like some? Ilara's eyes widened slightly. It was a simple offer, a drink, but it felt like a significant gesture, a breaking of an invisible barrier. Oh no, thank you, sir. I couldn't. He smiled, a genuine warm smile that lit up his face and made his eyes crinkle at the corners. It was a smile Ilara had never seen before, a stark contrast to the reserved professionalism he usually displayed. Nonsense, he said, his voice light. It's a good evening for a shared view, and for a moment we're just two people watching the sun go down. He walked over to a small side table, poured a small amount of the amber liquid into a clean glass, and handed it to her. Ilara took it, her fingers brushing against his. The warmth of his touch sent a curious tremor through her. She raised the glass, her gaze meeting his over the rim. To perspective, she said, her voice a little shaky. To perspective, he echoed, clinking his glass gently against hers. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, side by side, watching the last vestiges of daylight fade. The city lights began to twinkle below, mirroring the stars that were starting to appear in the darkening sky. It was a moment of quiet understanding, a shared breath in the vastness of their separate lives. For Ilara, it was a revelation. The formidable CEO, the man she had only known as a distant figure, was also a man who could appreciate a sunset, who could offer a drink, who could share a moment of quiet reflection. And in that shared moment, the invisible lines between Maid and CEO blurred, replaced by the simple, human connection of two souls, appreciating the beauty of the world together. Chapter 4. A Glimmer of Vulnerability. The shared sunset became a quiet, unspoken turning point. While their formal roles remained unchanged, the atmosphere between Ilara and Julian Sterling had undeniably shifted. He no longer seemed like a distant, untouchable entity. He began to engage Ilara in brief, almost casual conversations, not about her duties, but about the mundane aspects of his day. Did you notice the weather forecast, Ilara? He might ask, as she was preparing his breakfast. Looks like rain later. Or, as she was tidying his study, he might comment, this report is proving more stubborn than I anticipated. These were not commands or instructions. They were observations, shared thoughts that allowed Ilara a peek into the human behind the CEO. She found herself responding with more than just perfunctory replies, offering her own gentle observations, or simply a listening ear. Her knowledge of his routines now extended to an understanding of his preferences, his moods, and the subtle cues that indicated his inner state. One afternoon, Ilara was dusting the extensive collection of books in Julian's study. He was engrossed in a phone call, his voice tight with frustration. As he ended the call, he let out a sharp, guttural sound that was more a groan than a sigh. He then slammed his hand down on the desk, a rare display of unbridled anger. The sound echoed through the quiet room, startling Ilara. She hesitated, her duster frozen in her hand. Her instinct was to withdraw, to make herself even smaller, but a deeper impulse, born from weeks of quiet observation, urged her forward. She saw the raw frustration etched on his face, the tension in his jaw. He looked utterly defeated. Taking a deep breath, Ilara walked over to his desk. She didn't speak, but instead, she reached for the small, antique silver tray on which he kept his desk essentials. With meticulous care, she arranged his pens, aligned his notepad, and straightened a stack of papers that had been slightly askew from his outburst. It was a small act of restoration, a silent attempt to bring order back to his immediate space. Julian Sterling watched her, his anger slowly draining from his face, replaced by a flicker of surprise and something akin to shame. He had never shown such a raw emotion in front of her before. He had always maintained an iron grip on his composure. When Ilara finished, she looked at him, her gaze steady but soft. "Is there anything else I can do, sir?" she asked, her voice gentle. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes looking a little lost. No, Alara. Thank you. That was unnecessary, but appreciated. The apology, however slight, was significant. He rarely acknowledged her efforts beyond a polite nod. It is my job to maintain order, sir, she replied softly. He looked at her for a long moment, his icy blue eyes seeming to soften. Sometimes, Alara, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, order is precisely what's needed most. He then leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window, a subtle vulnerability clinging to him like a shadow. Alara retreated to her duties, her heart aflutter. She had witnessed a crack in the impenetrable armor of Julian Sterling. She had seen his frustration, his fleeting anger, and his subsequent vulnerability. And in that moment, he seemed less like the CEO and more like a man burdened by the weight of his world. Her role, she realized, was not just to clean and polish, but to be a quiet constant, a steady presence in the often turbulent life of the man who inhabited the penthouse. The unseen touch was no longer just about dusting and tidying. It was about offering silent solace, a subtle balm to a wounded spirit, and in doing so, she was weaving herself, thread by invisible thread, into the fabric of his life. Chapter 5. Whispers of a Shared Past. The vulnerability Alara had witnessed in Julian Sterling seemed to have deepened their unspoken connection. He began to share more personal anecdotes, fleeting glimpses into his past that painted a picture far removed from the cutthroat world of business. He spoke of his childhood, of a lonely estate and demanding parents, of a yearning for a simpler life that he often suppressed. One rainy afternoon, Alara was arranging some fresh flowers in the living room when Julian Sterling walked in, carrying a worn, leather-bound photo album. He looked contemplative, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked windows. "My mother," he said, his voice soft, as he sat down on the plush sofa. He gestured for Alara to sit on a nearby chair, an invitation that surprised her. She loved this weather, said it was a time for introspection. Alara sat, her hands clasped in her lap, her heart thrumming with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. She had never been invited to sit with him before, let alone engage in such personal conversation. Julian opened the album, his fingers tracing the faded images. "This was taken at our family estate, a place of quiet grandeur." He pointed to a photograph of a stern-looking woman in a formal garden. "My mother. She instilled in me a sense of duty, of the importance of legacy, but perhaps at the expense of happiness." He turned another page, revealing a younger Julian, looking somewhat awkward and solitary. "I was always the dutiful son, the heir apparent. There wasn't much room for childish whims or personal aspirations. Everything was about building, about ensuring the Sterling name endured." Alara listened intently, absorbing the quiet melancholy in his voice. She saw a different Julian Sterling now, one who carried the weight of expectation and the ghosts of a less than perfect childhood. "Did you have any aspirations, sir?" she asked softly, the question born from a genuine curiosity. Julian chuckled, a dry, almost sad sound. "I wanted to be an architect once, to build beautiful, functional spaces, but that wasn't deemed a practical pursuit for the Sterling heir." He sighed, closing the album with a soft thud. "So I built an empire instead." He looked at Alara, a searching look in his eyes. "And you, Alara, what did you dream of before this?" Alara felt a blush creep up her neck. Her dreams had always been modest, centered on security and a quiet life. But to articulate them to Julian Sterling felt surprisingly vulnerable. I enjoyed reading," she admitted, "and I always admired people who could create beautiful things with their hands, like intricate embroidery or delicate pottery." Julian nodded slowly as if weighing her words. "Creating beauty. Yes, there's a profound satisfaction in that. Perhaps in its own way, it's as important as building an empire." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "You have a quiet artistry about you, Alara. The way you arrange things, the way you maintain this space, it's not just cleaning, it's curating." Alara's heart swelled with an unexpected warmth. To have her efforts, her quiet diligence recognized as something more than mere chores, by him, meant a great deal. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. They sat in silence for a few moments, the rain providing a soothing soundtrack to their quiet conversation. The photo album lay between them, a tangible link to Julian's past, a symbol of the vulnerabilities he was now willing to share. Ilara, the maid, was no longer just an observer of his present. She was becoming a confidant, a silent keeper of his past, her understanding of him deepening with each shared whisper, each revelation of the man beneath the CEO's formidable exterior. The sterile penthouse was slowly transforming into a space where two lives, once so distant, were beginning to intertwine. Chapter 6: The Unforeseen Crisis. The fragile peace and growing intimacy between Ilara and Julian Sterling was abruptly shattered by a crisis that shook Sterling Corporation to its core. News broke of a major financial scandal involving a subsidiary company, threatening to tarnish the entire Sterling brand. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of quiet order, transformed into a war room. Phones rang incessantly, urgent meetings were called, and Julian Sterling was a whirlwind of controlled fury and intense strategizing. Ilara, ever vigilant, observed the chaos from the periphery. She saw the toll the crisis was taking on Julian. His usual sharp focus was now laced with a desperate urgency. His ice-blue eyes, usually so clear and commanding, were clouded with worry and exhaustion. He barely ate, slept even less, and his temper, usually well-contained, frayed at the edges. During one particularly heated late-night conference call, Julian paced the study, his voice a low, strained growl. Ilara, quietly tidying the adjoining living area, could hear snippets of the conversation, accusations, threats, the impending collapse of deals. When the call ended, he sank into his desk chair, his head in his hands, the picture of a man under immense pressure. Ilara, against her better judgment and her ingrained sense of protocol, found herself unable to simply retreat. She had seen him vulnerable before, but this felt different. This was a genuine threat to everything he had built, everything he stood for. She approached his desk cautiously. "Sir," she began, her voice barely audible above his heavy breathing. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and weary. "What is it, Ilara?" he asked, his tone abrupt, devoid of its usual warmth. I noticed you haven't eaten," she said, gesturing towards an untouched tray of sandwiches. "And you haven't slept properly for days." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Sleep is a luxury I cannot afford right now, Ilara. And as for food," he waved a dismissive hand. "But sir," Ilara persisted, her voice gaining a quiet strength, "you cannot make clear decisions if you are running on empty. Your team needs you at your best. Sterling Corporation needs you at your best." Julian looked at her, surprised by her directness, her concern. He saw not just a maid, but someone who genuinely cared about his well-being, and by extension the company's fate. He considered her words for a long moment, the raw desperation in his eyes softening slightly. "You're right, of course," he conceded, his voice rough. "It's just the weight of it all." "Let me make you some tea, sir," Ilara offered. "A strong one, and perhaps just one of those sandwiches, for strength." He gave a small, weary nod. "Thank you, Ilara." As Ilara prepared the tea, she realized the true extent of the crisis. The scandal was more serious than she had initially understood. Rumors of bankruptcy, of hostile takeovers, swirled through the penthouse like a dark storm. Julian was not just fighting for his company. He was fighting for his legacy, his very identity. Later, as Julian sat at his desk, sipping the tea and slowly eating a sandwich, Ilara stood quietly by, a silent, steady presence. She saw the immense pressure he was under, the fear that flickered in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, and in that moment, her role as a maid felt insignificant compared to her growing desire to offer him support, to be a quiet anchor in the tempest that was threatening to engulf him. The crisis had not only exposed the fragility of his empire, but had also revealed the depth of her burgeoning feelings for the man beneath the CEO's facade. Chapter 7: A Shoulder to Lean On. The Sterling Corporation crisis raged on, a relentless tempest that battered Julian Sterling and his company. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a besieged fortress. Ilara continued her duties, her movements quieter, her presence more unobtrusive than ever. She became a silent observer of his struggle, her heart aching with a mixture of empathy and burgeoning affection. Julian was a shadow of his former self. The sharp lines of his face were etched deeper with fatigue and stress. He often worked through the night, his study illuminated by the cold glow of his computer screen, the city lights outside a distant, indifferent spectacle. Alara would often find him staring blankly at the cityscape, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his responsibilities crushing him. One night, after a particularly grueling day of damage control and media scrutiny, Julian returned to the penthouse long after midnight. Alara, who had been waiting up, heard his weary footsteps and the faint sound of a door closing softly. She found him standing in the dimly lit living room, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. He looked utterly defeated. Without a word, Alara moved towards the kitchen. She knew his routine, his preferences, even in his current state. She brewed his favorite calming chamomile tea, adding a touch of honey, just as he liked it when he was particularly stressed. She brought it to him, along with a soft throw blanket. "Sir," she said gently, placing the tray on a nearby table, "you need to rest. Let me help you." Julian turned, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He looked at the tea, the blanket, and then at Alara. For a moment he seemed lost for words. Then, in a gesture that surprised them both, he reached out and gently took her hand. His touch was cold, his fingers trembling slightly. "Alara," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how much longer I can. I don't know if I can win this." Tears welled up in Alara's eyes. Seeing the formidable Julian Sterling so vulnerable, so close to breaking, was more than she could bear. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she squeezed his gently. "You are strong, sir," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her own hands. "You have built something incredible. This is a difficult time, but you will get through it." He looked at her, his icy blue eyes searching her face. "You believe that?" "I do," Alara said, her gaze unwavering, "and so do your employees." "And I do." A single tear traced a path down Julian's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Instead, he leaned his forehead against hers, a silent acknowledgement of her comfort, her unwavering support. He was no longer the CEO, he was just a man, seeking solace in the quiet strength of the woman who had become his unseen confidant. They stood there for a long time, a silent tableau in the dimly lit penthouse. Alara didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. She simply offered her presence, her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in him. She became this silent anchor, the steady hand in the storm. Julian, for his part, found a refuge in her calm demeanor, a respite from the relentless pressure. In that moment, the lines between employer and employee, between Maid and CEO, blurred into the simple, profound connection of two souls finding solace in each other's quiet strength. The crisis, though devastating, had forged an unexpected bond, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, a shoulder to lean on could be the most valuable asset of all. Chapter 8. A Glimmer of Hope. The night Alara had offered Julian Sterling her quiet support, something shifted. The crisis at Sterling Corporation didn't magically disappear, but the relentless pressure on Julian seemed to ease, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. He still worked tirelessly, but the gnawing despair had receded, replaced by a steely determination. Alara's unwavering belief in him had served as a much-needed catalyst, reminding him of his own resilience. The following days saw a concerted effort to salvage the company. Julian, with his revitalized spirit, rallied his most trusted advisors. Meetings were long and intense, but now they were fueled by a sense of strategy rather than desperation. Alara continued to be his silent support system. She ensured he ate, that he took brief breaks, and that his environment remained a haven of calm amidst the storm. She learned to anticipate his needs before he even voiced them, her intuition sharpened by weeks of close observation and genuine concern. One afternoon, as Julian was preparing to leave for a crucial board meeting, he paused at the door. He turned to Alara, who was meticulously arranging a small vase of lilies on a side table. "Alara," he said, his voice carrying a newfound warmth and sincerity, "I wanted to thank you, truly. Your presence, your belief, it made a significant difference." Alara's heart fluttered. "I am glad I could be of assistance, sir." Julian stepped closer, his ice-blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It was more than assistance, Alara. You offered perspective and strength, things I desperately needed. He hesitated, then reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through her. You have a remarkable spirit. Ilara felt a blush creep up her neck. She could only meet his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and something akin to hope. Later that week, the news broke. Sterling Corporation, against all odds, had weathered the storm. The subsidiary scandal was contained, key investors had been reassured, and the company's reputation, though bruised, was ultimately salvaged. A wave of relief washed over the penthouse, palpable even to Ilara. Julian Sterling returned home that evening, not with the weary exhaustion of previous weeks, but with a quiet triumph radiating from him. He found Ilara in the living room, packing away some of the extra cleaning supplies. "We did it, Ilara," he said, his voice filled with a profound sense of accomplishment. He walked over to her, a genuine, radiant smile on his face. "We did it." He reached out and took both her hands in his. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ilara looked up at him, her heart soaring. The crisis had been a crucible, forging a bond between them that transcended their professional roles. She saw not just the CEO who had saved his empire, but the man who had shared his vulnerability, his fears, and his eventual triumph. "You did it, sir," she corrected gently. "Your strength and determination are what saved Sterling Corporation." Julian shook his head. "And your quiet support was the foundation upon which I rebuilt that strength. You are more than just a maid, Ilara. You are a vital part of this place, of my life." He held her gaze for a moment, a silent question hanging in the air between them. The unspoken acknowledgement of their deepening connection, of the feelings that had bloomed in the sterile environment of the penthouse, was undeniable. The storm had passed, leaving behind not devastation, but a fragile, budding hope, a promise of something more, something beautiful, waiting to unfold. The future, once clouded by uncertainty, now shimmered with the possibility of shared sunrises and whispered dreams. Chapter 9. A Bold Proposition. The resolution of the Sterling Corporation crisis marked a new chapter, not just for the company, but for Julian Sterling and Ilara. The unspoken tension between them had blossomed into a palpable connection, a shared understanding that transcended their employer-employee relationship. Julian, no longer solely focused on the immediate survival of his company, began to actively seek Ilara's presence. He would find excuses to engage her in conversation, not about her duties, but about her thoughts, her dreams, her quiet observations of the world. He found himself drawn to her innate kindness, her quiet strength, and her ability to find beauty in the mundane. Her presence had become a source of calm and genuine happiness in his often turbulent life. He realized with a startling clarity that the sterile perfection of the penthouse was incomplete without her human touch, her gentle spirit. One evening, as the city lights twinkled below, Julian found Ilara carefully polishing the crystal decanter in the bar area. The soft glow of the ambient lighting cast a warm aura around her, and Julian found himself captivated by her grace. He walked over, a determined glint in his ice-blue eyes. "Ilara," he began, his voice steady and resonant. "We've shared a great deal these past few weeks, more than I ever anticipated sharing with anyone." Ilara looked up, a hint of surprise in her eyes. She sensed a shift, a prelude to something significant. "You have been my anchor, my confidant, my light," Julian continued. "You saw me at my weakest, and you offered your strength without reservation. I have grown to care for you, Ilara, deeply." Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. The words she had longed to hear yet never dared to hope for were finally being spoken. She could only look at him, a silent question in her eyes. Julian took a deep breath. "I know our circumstances are unconventional. I am the CEO, and you were my maid. But those titles feel utterly insignificant when I am with you." He paused, gathering his courage. "Ilara, I want to offer you something more. I want to ask you to be more than just a presence in this penthouse. I want to ask you to be my partner." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion and implication. Ilara's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Marriage? To Julian Sterling, it felt like a dream, too fantastical to be real. She thought of her humble beginnings, her life of quiet service, and then of the man standing before her, the titan of industry who was offering her his heart. "Sir, Julian," she stammered, her voice trembling, I don't know what to say. This is unexpected." Julian stepped closer, gently taking her hands. "I understand it's a lot to take in, but I am not asking you to fulfill a role, Alara. I am asking you to share a life. My life. I want to build a future with you. A future filled with the kind of quiet beauty you appreciate, with art and books and shared sunsets." He looked at her earnestly. "I know I haven't always been the easiest man, but I promise you, my love for you will be unwavering. My respect for you will be absolute." He searched her face, his hope palpable. "Will you marry me, Ilara?" Ilara looked into his eyes, seeing not the powerful CEO, but the vulnerable man who had shared his tears and his triumphs with her. She saw the sincerity, the depth of his feelings, and she realized that her own feelings for him had grown far beyond the professional admiration she had once harbored. He had seen her, truly seen her, and in his eyes she was not just a maid, but a woman worthy of his love and respect. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, mirroring the hope that had been building within her. The sterile perfection of the penthouse, once a symbol of his wealth, now felt like the beginning of their shared story, a story that had begun with an unseen touch and was now poised to bloom into a lifetime of love. "Yes, Julian," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Chapter 10. A New Beginning. The city of light seemed to shimmer with a new brilliance the night Ilara accepted Julian Sterling's proposal. The penthouse, once a symbol of his solitary success, was now imbued with the promise of a shared future, a testament to a love that had bloomed in the most unexpected of circumstances. The news of their engagement sent ripples through the Sterling Corporation, a mix of surprise, admiration, and quiet curiosity. The maid who had charmed the formidable CEO was a topic of much hushed conversation, but Julian, shielded by his newfound happiness, paid no heed to the gossip. Their wedding was a surprisingly intimate affair, held in the penthouse itself, with the city skyline as their witness. Ilara, radiant in a simple, elegant ivory gown, looked every bit the lady of the manor. Julian, his gaze never leaving hers, stood beside her, his hand clasped firmly in hers, a silent promise of unwavering devotion. They exchanged vows that spoke of mutual respect, shared dreams, and a love that had transcended societal expectations. Life after the wedding was a beautiful unfolding. Ilara, now Mrs. Sterling, seamlessly transitioned into her new role. She brought her innate grace and quiet sensibility to the grander scale of Julian's life, not as a submissive wife, but as an equal partner. She encouraged Julian's artistic inclinations, helping him curate art for their home, and even suggesting he explore his long-dormant architectural dreams, perhaps for smaller, personal projects. She found joy in hosting elegant dinners, not with the stiff formality of the past, but with a warmth and genuine hospitality that made every guest feel welcome. Julian, in turn, cherished Ilara's presence. Her calm demeanor soothed his often frazzled nerves, and her insightful observations offered him fresh perspectives. He found himself sharing more of his burdens with her, confiding in her not just as his wife, but as his closest friend and confidant. Their penthouse was no longer just a luxurious residence. It was a true home, where their shared dreams could flourish. It was a home filled with laughter, love, and the quiet hum of shared dreams. One crisp autumn afternoon, months after their wedding, Ilara found Julian sketching at his desk, a familiar, contented smile on his face. He was working on designs for a new wing of their country estate, a project born from Ilara's gentle encouragement. "What are you creating, my love?" Ilara asked, leaning over his shoulder, her hand resting on his. Julian turned, his ice-blue eyes warm and full of affection. "A space for us, Ilara. A place to grow old together. A testament to the journey we've taken." He gestured to the blueprints, from unseen touches to shared sunsets, from crises to confessions, and now, to this. Ilara's heart swelled with love. She had come into his life as the unseen maid, a silent observer in his opulent world, but through quiet acts of kindness, unwavering support, and a shared vulnerability, she had become so much more. She was his wife, his partner, his equal. The story of the maid and the CEO had ended not with a fairy tale flourish, but with the quiet, profound beauty of a love story that was just beginning. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most ordinary beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary destinies, all sparked by an unseen touch that dared to reach out and connect. Their life together was a masterpiece, painted with the vibrant colors of love, respect, and a shared appreciation for the simple yet profound beauty of life.